Part 5, transport across membranes. So this covers quite a large section of work, but I would say this section really does cut across the whole of your GCSE. So I'm going to spend a tiny bit more time on these three things because I think they're very important. The three areas of transport across membranes is diffusion, osmosis and active transport. So let's get started. We'll start off with diffusion. Now I'm going to ask you to learn a set definition. So this definition here, diffusion is the spreading out of the particles of any substance in solution or particles of a gas, resulting in a net movement from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So what we have here is a cell, and you can see inside the cell there are some, let's say that's oxygen, okay, and there's less oxygen inside the cell, and there's a higher concentration outside the cell, and what will happen is that there'll be a net movement from outside to inside the cell. So particles move from a higher to a lower concentration. Diffusion is affected by different factors, so different factors affect the speed of diffusion. So things like temperature, concentration gradient and surface area of membrane. So this will be quite important when we talk about gas exchange in a bit. So first of all, temperature. So the higher the temperature, the faster the rate of diffusion. So as you can see by this picture, that in hot water, this blue ink spreads more quickly from a higher to a lower concentration until an equilibrium is reached. Concentration gradient. It's quite difficult to understand what a concentration gradient is, but I like to think of it as a slide. So here we've got A and B. So A is a steep slide, B is a more shallow slide with a shallow gradient. Okay, and what happens is the steeper the concentration gradient, the faster diffusion takes place. So as you can see, if you've got a higher concentration and a very low concentration, there's a fast rate of diffusion. Whereas if you have a less steep concentration gradient, where you've got concentration gradients that are similar, there's a slower rate of diffusion. Still going from a higher to a lower concentration, but it is slower. But this is the key thing you need to remember. The steeper the concentration gradient, the faster the rate of diffusion. Surface area of membrane is really important. So for example, here I've got a fish gill. So fish gills have large number of gill filaments. These gill filaments are tiny, they're microscopic, and they increase the surface area of the gill. Another example is our lungs. So we're going to talk about our lungs in a minute. In our lungs we have millions and millions of alveoli, and those increase the surface area. So basically, the larger the surface area, the faster the rate of diffusion. Okay, so on to the next type of transport across membranes, which in this case is osmosis. And osmosis is the movement of water across cell membranes. So osmosis is the diffusion of water from a dilute solution to a concentrated solution through a partially permeable membrane. So very simply, water moves across a partially permeable membrane. The bigger molecules like sucrose in this example, they cannot pass through this partially permeable membrane. Now, what's key thing is, what is a dilute solution? Well, here I've got some different beakers with blackcurrant cordial in, and you can see the left one, that is more dilute. The reason it's more dilute is that it has a higher concentration of water molecules than sugar molecules, and then you can see that as we go to the right, the concentrations are basically it's getting more concentrated, so a more concentrated solution. So getting to the one on the right, there is basically a less dilute amount of water, and there's more sugar molecules. Okay, so we say that a dilute solution to a concentrated solution through a partially permeable membrane. So it's important water moves from a dilute solution, which is a higher concentration of water, to a concentrated solution, so a lower concentration of water. There we go. So dilute, there's more water molecules. Concentrated, there's less water molecules. So why is osmosis important? Well, cells need to maintain a water balance so that they can stay hydrated and function properly to allow chemical reactions to occur. So for example, when you exercise, you're going to lose water and ions in sweat. So it's important to replace these as much as possible so little water is drawn into the cells. It's important to replace these as too much or too little water is drawn into the cells by osmosis, so you can become dehydrated and it will affect chemical reactions. When too much water enters cells by osmosis, because the cell only has a cell membrane, the cells can eventually burst and obviously cause a big problem. There is a required practical in this section of work. So this required practical is looking at osmosis in plant tissue. So I go through an example with potato chips, with potato tissue. I will put the link in the description of the video, so please do check that out. It's really important that you check out the required practicals as they are a key part of your work for your GCSE. So on to the third and final transport across membranes process, which is active transport. So active transport moves substances from a dilute solution to a more concentrated solution. So that's against a concentration gradient. So this requires energy from respiration. Okay, so you can see in this diagram, you've got the cell membrane and you've got a dilute solution here. So it's a low concentration of particles and they've got to move against the concentration gradient. So there's a more concentrated solution on this side of the cell. So you need energy from respiration in the mitochondria to, energy is required to move it against that concentration gradient. Quick recap on respiration. So you should know that respiration does release energy. So energy is needed to move molecules against a concentration gradient. And aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria of the cell. So you can see the word equation for aerobic respiration. So here's a diagram to try and explain it to you. So if you think about diffusion and osmosis, you've got a higher concentration and basically it's a bit like passing a boulder down a hill, so it will go down really easily. It's known as passive transport because no extra energy is required, whereas we look on the right hand side and if you imagine you're trying to push a boulder up a hill, you're going to need to use a lot of energy. So when you move from a lower concentration to a higher concentration, then it will move sorry, that's my dog. So move from a lower to a higher concentration. So this does require energy. Okay, particles move against a concentration gradient and the energy is needed to move molecules from a low to a high concentration. I'm now going to go on to part 6. So I'm not going to go through some questions because the types of questions that you get for this section of work on transport across membranes are very applied. So they give you specific examples. So I'm going to do that at the end of part 6. So let's start part 6. So part 6, gas exchange. There are 3 main things that you need to remember. So I'm going to give you some specific examples that are mentioned in the specification, but these 3 things are all you need to know about gas exchange when you look at some information that they might give you. And the key things are to increase gas exchange, you need a large surface area to increase the rate of diffusion. You need thin membranes to provide a short diffusion pathway, and you need to maintain a steep concentration gradient. So for example, blood moves substances quickly, or the lungs move gases quickly. So in the exam, there will be, there could be four different examples, sorry. So in humans, it's the lungs, the villi, and then in plants, you're going to look at the leaf, and then in fish, you need to look at fish gills. So as it says here, multicellular organisms have a large surface area to volume ratio. So in lungs, you have many millions of alveoli. They've got a massive surface area, they're thin, and they've got a really good blood supply. So you can see the blood moving past the alveoli. So when you breathe in, the oxygen is in a much higher concentration inside the alveoli than it is in the blood. So that means that oxygen will diffuse very quickly into the red blood cells and then be moved away. And you can see the deoxygenated blood coming here, and carbon dioxide in the plasma is in much higher concentration. So when you breathe out, it moves across the membranes through the alveoli and then out of the alveoli in your lungs and through your mouth. The other example is the villi. So in your small intestine, you've got millions of villi that line the small intestine, increasing the surface area, and they are a single layer of cells, and they've got a really good blood supply, so they're maintaining that concentration gradient. Exchange in plants is slightly different. So here we've got a leaf. So this is the top of the leaf, and you can see the palisade cells, the spongy mesophyll, the stomata, and the stomata is where oxygen and carbon dioxide will diffuse in and out of. So the surface of the leaf is very thin and it's flattened, so that increases the surface area for more gas exchange. So in the spongy mesophyll, you've got air spaces that increase the rate of diffusion, and they diffuse in and out of the stomata. Guard cells open and close the stomata, controlling water loss. And then exchange in fish. So fish have gills, and they have many gill filaments, as this diagram shows. And you can see that water enters the fish through the mouth and it goes out through the gills. The oxygen is transported from the water to the blood by diffusion. Each gill has gill filaments, which give the gills a large surface area, and it says lamellae. You probably don't need to know this, but they cover each gill filament to further increase the surface area. They've got good blood supply, they're very thin as well. So this is all about maintaining concentration gradients because of the movement of water and also the movement of blood. You've got thin walls and you've got a massive surface area. Okay, so let's look at some questions related to transport across membranes, including diffusion, osmosis, active transport, and gas exchange. So as usual, I'd like you in a minute to pause this video, and I'd like you to really have a go at doing this question. So pause in 3, 2, 1. And welcome back. So the diagram shows 4 ways in which molecules may move into and out of cells. So the dots are showing the concentration of molecules. So they've got the cell is respiring aerobically, so that means with oxygen, and it says which arrow, A, B, C or D, represents the movement of oxygen molecules. Well, we've got to remember about diffusion. It moves from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, so you need to look at the diagram to work out, well, which has a higher concentration. Okay, and basically the and therefore moving in, and that will be A. So question is A. So movement of carbon dioxide molecules, well, that would be B, because there's more inside the cell and there's less outside the cell. So movement of carbon dioxide out of the cell. Name the process by which gases move into and out. It's diffusion. You can't have osmosis because it's related to gases of oxygen and carbon dioxide. C. Which arrow represents the active uptake of sugar molecules? Well, that would be from a lower to a higher concentration. So in this case, it would be C, because it's uptake, and the reason being because there's uptake against a concentration gradient. Okay, so that's the idea, that it's against the concentration gradient. There we go. So there are the answers. Okay, question 2. So this is about gas exchange. So this shows part of the lungs. So again, what I would like you to do is spend about 3-4 minutes answering this. So please do pause in 3, 2, 1. Okay, welcome back. Right, so give 2 ways the lungs are adapted for efficient exchange. Describe how each adaptation helps to maintain efficient gas exchange. So they want you 2 adaptations, so 2 features or structures, and then a description of each. So you can have many answers here. So for example, adaptation 1, there are lots of alveoli. Okay, and then to get the second mark, you need to say, why are there many alveoli? Well, that means that it provides a larger surface area. You could have good blood supply because they show lots of blood vessels. And what's that doing? Well, that maintains a steep diffusion gradient or concentration gradient between the blood and the alveoli. It's also got very thin walls. You can't really see that by that diagram, but they do have thin walls, so it basically means that diffusion rates are quick because it doesn't have a large distance to travel. You could also have about ventilation as well. So when you breathe in and out, you're maintaining a steep diffusion gradient. So there are 4 examples. You only need 2 of those examples, but it's important you write down the adaptation. So in other words, the structure or the fact that it's a thin wall or good blood supply, many alveoli or well ventilated, and then the description.